In this lecture video, we're learning about how to process string data. By the end of this video series, you'll be able to understand that strings are lists of characters. You'll be able to write Python statements to use input and output with string values. You'll remember how to use the operators plus and the asterisk on string data. You'll know that you can treat a string like a list and isolate individual character values within the string. You'll know how to process strings using built-in functions like length that typically work with lists. And you'll be able to use a loop to process individual characters from a string and be able to convert string values to an integer or other numeric data type. You may remember from earlier in the semester that text or character-based data is stored as a string data type in Python. A string is made up of a list of characters, and these characters can be letters, numbers, or special characters on the keyboard. Almost any character on the keyboard can be stored in a string. Some examples we've seen earlier in the semester include storing something like a greeting, like the phrase hello. You can include punctuation or not with a string data value. Another example we've seen earlier in the semester is storing something like a name as a string. Something like my name. Remember that when you're assigning a literal string value to a variable, you need to use the double quotes to delimit the text that should be stored. We've also seen that you can store information that's numeric as a string if you don't want to process it using arithmetic operators. For example, if you're storing something like a student ID number, that might be stored as a string because you're unlikely to want to perform mathematical calculations on your student ID. Earlier in the semester, we learned how to use input with string data, so we'll be reviewing that here. We'll also review how to use output with strings. Remember that to receive any input in Python, we need to use the input command, which uses the reserved word input. We also need to provide a prompt, which tells the user what kind of information we're expecting them to enter. We put the prompt inside parentheses, and because the prompt is usually text information, we also have to include double quotes around any text in the prompt. So for example, if we wanted the user to enter a string that represents their last name, we might use this input command, input, please enter your last name. The prompt will print out to the screen and the user will be provided time to type in their last name. When the user presses enter, all of the information that's received through the input command is stored into the variable that appears on the left side of the assignment operator. In this case, it's the variable last name. So suppose that we were running a program with this particular input command in it. What would be stored in the variable last name if the user entered the value Smith at standard input? The computer would store the value Smith into our variable called last name. You might think of that as having our variable last name, the identifier for the memory location, and inside the memory location, we'd store that collection of characters, Smith. But realize that behind the scenes, the computer isn't storing all 5 characters in a single memory location. It's storing them in a group of memory locations that happen to be next to each other. So what it's actually doing is storing the S in a memory location, the M in a memory location adjacent to it, the I in the next memory location, then a T, and then finally the H in Smith. And so what it's doing is creating a list of data values where each value in the string is a single character. Python treats strings just like lists. It's a series of individual memory cells that are adjacent to each other, and Python thinks of them each as having an address or a number associated with them. Just like lists, it starts numbering the locations at index 0, and it goes up to the number of items in the collection -1 as the largest index. Suppose that we ran our program and the user typed in a value like 12345 as the value of last name. What would get stored in memory? The computer does not care if you store a numeric value in a string, and so it would happily store the string 12345 inside the last name. Realize it would be storing this as a string of data, but wouldn't be storing it as a single numeric value, 12,345. Instead, it would be storing the 1-digit, the 2-digit, the 3-digit, the 4-digit, and the 5-digit, all next to each other as characters in a list. The first index in the list would be 0, and the last index in the list would be 4. So remember, does the computer know or care whether the user enters letters or numbers as the value of a string? No, the computer does not care. The computer will read in data as a string value or character-based data, even if it's numeric or special characters. It's not limited to just storing alphabetic characters in a string. Earlier in the semester, we learned how to display information in a string variable to standard output. Here are some examples. We can store a literal value like a phrase hello. We could store the contents of a variable that happens to store string data, or we could display a combination of the two, a literal value perhaps as a label, and then also data that's stored inside a variable. Just remember, anytime you're using a literal value, you need to include the double quotes. If you're referencing a memory location, then don't include double quotes around the identifier. So suppose that we have the last name variable and it stores the value Smith. What would print if we executed these 3 print statements? The first line that says print hello would print the phrase hello. And remember, when Python prints things out, it doesn't include the double quotes around it. So it would just print the characters HELLO. Whenever we print the last name, it would print the contents of that variable, the one that's associated with last name. And so if that were storing the value Smith, it would print Smith to the screen. And then finally, if we used the syntax to combine the two together, it would print the word hello, and then the comma would print a space, and then it would print the last name Smith.